On November 25, 1177, a dying 16-year-old boy with bandaged hands and 500 knights faced down 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors. By sunset, the most powerful Muslim army in the world lay shattered, and history's most unlikely military genius had written his legend in blood. Think about those numbers for a second. 500 against 26,000. That's a 52-to-1 disadvantage. The fate of Christian civilization in the Holy Land hung by a thread so thin it was invisible. It was a thread spun from the last breaths of a Leper King, a thread about to be snapped by the most formidable war machine the East had seen in a century. Yet, by the end of this video, you'll understand how a teenage Leper King achieved the impossible, why Saladin, the greatest Muslim commander of the age, made the fatal error that cost him everything, and what really happened in those savage moments when faith collided with steel, when the very air trembled with the sound of prayers and the screams of the dying. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see medieval warfare forever. First, the secret signal that turned certain death into total victory, a gesture so simple, so profound, it ignited a fire in the hearts of 500 doomed men. Second, why Saladin's elite bodyguard, the Mamluks, who'd sworn to die for him, fled on camels, abandoning their legendary leader in his moment of ultimate shame. And third, the haunting final words between Baldwin and Saladin that history tried to forget, a whispered exchange across the bloody chasm of war that speaks volumes about the respect between these two titans. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable, what pushes it from the pages of history into the realm of legend. How did Baldwin even hold a sword, with advanced leprosy eating away at his flesh, his nerves dead, his fingers crumbling? What tactical mistake did Saladin make that no historian saw coming, a blind spot in his otherwise flawless military mind? Why did Muslim chroniclers themselves call this battle a divine punishment, a scourge from Allah upon their pride? How could seasoned Mamluk cavalry warriors who'd never known defeat break before teenage knights, their courage evaporating like mist in the desert sun? How could 90% of an army simply vanish in one afternoon, swallowed by the dust and the ravines of a forgotten plain? This is the story of the masked king who couldn't feel pain versus the sultan who had never known defeat. It is a story of agony and empire, of a body failing and a will of iron refusing to bend. To understand how 500 men destroyed an empire's might, we need to step back from that blood-soaked field, from the moment of impact, and journey to when Jerusalem itself was preparing for the end, when the very stones of the city seemed to weep in anticipation of the coming storm. The year 1177 marked the darkest hour for the Crusader kingdoms. For nearly 8 decades, Christian knights had clung to their precarious footholds in the Holy Land, their castles stark sentinels in a sea of sand and hostility. But now the tide was turning, and turning fast. The great Crusader fortresses that once dominated the landscape, Croc des Chevaliers, Margat, were falling, one by one. Not to massive assaults, but to the slow, inexorable pressure of a resurgent Islamic world united under one man, Saladin. But in Jerusalem, something extraordinary, something terrifying occupied the throne. Baldwin IV, crowned at 13, carried a curse that should have killed him years ago: leprosy. The disease medieval minds saw as God's own judgment, a living death that separated a man from his fellow humans long before his soul departed. It was a death sentence written on the skin, a gradual, public dissolution. By 16, his body was failing him in ways we can scarcely imagine. His hands, wrapped in silk bandages to hide the stumps of lost fingers and the weeping sores, could barely grip a sword. His face, hidden behind a silver mask, concealed features ravaged by disease, a visage that made courtiers avert their eyes. They whispered in the marble halls that he was cursed by God, that his very presence on the throne was an ill omen for the kingdom. Yet somehow, impossibly, he ruled with a clarity and a fierce intelligence that stunned friend and foe alike. The disease that was consuming his body seemed to have sharpened his mind to a razor's edge. He was a strategist in a dying shell, a king whose every waking moment was a battle against decay.
They called him the Leper King, the boy who shouldn't be alive, much less leading armies. And in his quiet, pained voice, there was a resolve that could silence a war council of grizzled barons. Facing him stood Saladin, the sword of Islam, a leader who combined military genius with a genuine, profound piety. At 40, he was in the prime of his life and power. He had united the fractured realms of Egypt and Syria, forging the most powerful Muslim state since the early caliphates. His army, a vast multi-ethnic force of Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, had crushed every force sent against it. His reputation alone, the mere whisper of his name, could empty castles without firing a shot. He was not just a conqueror, he was a unifier, a man on a holy mission to purify the land of the cross-bearing invaders. While Baldwin fought his own decaying body, Saladin commanded an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. The power dynamic was laughably, tragically, one-sided. The Crusader states, fractured by internal rivalries, petty jealousies, and the constant struggle for resources, could muster perhaps 15,000 men in total, scattered across dozens of castles and cities. Saladin, from his throne in Cairo and Damascus, commanded over 100,000 warriors, with the endless wealth of Egypt's Nile Delta, funding endless campaigns. It wasn't a question of if the Crusaders would fall, but when. In the back chambers of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Jerusalem's nobles already made secret preparations for exile. Ships waited in the ports of Acre and Tyre, their holds empty, ready for a frantic flight. Treaties were quietly negotiated with Italian merchant states, bargaining for safe passage. The smart money, the cold, hard logic of geopolitics, said the Kingdom of Jerusalem had months, maybe weeks, before it was wiped from the map. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you, what the dry historical records failed to capture. Baldwin IV wasn't just fighting Saladin. He was racing against his own body, a cruel hourglass where the sand was his own flesh. He knew each battle might be his last, each council his final act of rule. Every victory, every decision was purchased with agony no healthy man could endure, a currency of pain that he alone possessed. He was buying time for his kingdom with the coins of his own suffering. As autumn turned to winter in 1177, the intelligence reports brought to the court in Jerusalem were terrifying, the stuff of nightmares. Saladin was massing the largest army of his career. The number was staggering, unbelievable. 26,000 mounted warriors,
This was not a raiding party. This was an avalanche. It included his elite Mamluk cavalry, the slave soldiers trained from childhood for one purpose: war. They were the special forces of the medieval world, men who lived and breathed combat. Their destination was obvious, whispered on the wind and confirmed by terrified spies: Jerusalem itself. The arithmetic of annihilation was simple, brutal, and inescapable. Jerusalem's garrison, at its strongest, numbered less than 1,000 men. Against 26,000, they were a pebble before a tidal wave. The walls, though strong, required men to defend them. They would be stretched thin, overwhelmed, and broken. The city of David, of Christ, was on the brink of becoming another Muslim holy city. But as Saladin's massive host swept north from Egypt like a plague of locusts, darkening the horizon with their dust, something unprecedented was stirring in Jerusalem's throne room. A defiance was being born from despair. Inside Jerusalem's throne room, the air was thick with incense and fear. Baldwin IV, too weak to sit upright for long, was propped on a litter, his bandaged hands resting on his chest. He faced a decision that would define history, that would echo through the centuries. His advisors, the great barons of the kingdom, Raymond of Tripoli, the Ibelins, begged him to see reason, to flee. "Your Majesty," one pleaded, his voice trembling, "a leper king of 16 has no business leading a last stand. Your person is the symbol of the kingdom. To risk it is to risk everything. Let us garrison the city and wait for reinforcements from Europe." It was the logical choice, the sane choice. But Baldwin, carried to the war council on a litter because walking had become pure agony, spoke with a voice that was soft, yet it cut through the chamber like a knife, a voice that made hardened crusaders weep with a mixture of pity and awe. "I may die tomorrow or in 10 years, but I will die as I have lived, defending this kingdom, this city, this faith. God did not place me on this throne to flee from my duty. He gave me this cross of flesh to bear, and I will bear it to the gates of hell if I must. We will not wait behind these walls for our doom. We will march out and meet it." The mathematics of survival were brutal, an equation of almost certain death. Baldwin could muster only 500 knights. This tiny force included 80 Knights Templar, the warrior monks who took vows to never retreat, never surrender, never show mercy to Islam's warriors. They were the ultimate zealots, men who had renounced the world for God and the sword. Supporting them were barely 3,000 infantry, many of them local levies with more courage than training, farmers and townsfolk armed with spears and a desperate hope. Together, they faced annihilation. Saladin's host was something from an apocalyptic vision: 26,000 mounted warriors, a sea of lances and glittering helmets. Among them, 8,000 were Mamluk slave soldiers, each a masterpiece of martial training, each worth 3 ordinary cavalry in battle. The Muslim chroniclers themselves described it as an ocean of steel and faith, a force so vast it seemed to drink the rivers dry as it passed. The supply train alone stretched for miles, a mobile city of tents, smiths, and servants, evidence of Saladin's supreme confidence. He wasn't planning a raid, he was planning the final conquest, the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. What happened next shocked both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, an act of sheer audacious will that defied all medical and military logic. Baldwin, despite hands so damaged he needed servants to help him put on his armor, insisted on personally leading the army. The scene was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Templars, men known for their stoic brutality, wept openly as their king was lifted onto his warhorse, his body strapped to the saddle with leather bonds because his legs could no longer grip the animal's flanks. The silver mask, hiding his ravaged features, gleamed coldly in the pale November sun, a symbol of his hidden suffering and his unyielding resolve. "Look at me," Baldwin told his assembled knights, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "God gave me this disease, so that when we achieve victory, no man can claim it was by human strength alone. This victory will be his. We are merely his instruments." Saladin, camped near the coastal fortress of Ascalon, received reports of Baldwin's pathetic little force with amusement, even disdain. His emirs were already dividing up the conquered lands among themselves, arguing over the spoils of a victory they considered assured. Why shouldn't they be confident? The Sultan had gathered the largest Muslim army since the First Crusade had swept into the east. His scouts reported that Jerusalem's walls were barely manned, that the kingdom's best knights were scattered in distant fortresses, unable to concentrate in time. The trap was closing.
But Saladin made one fatal assumption, a psychological miscalculation that would unravel all his plans. He assumed that Baldwin, sick and inexperienced, would do the prudent thing, wait behind Jerusalem's massive walls. He underestimated the fire in the boy's soul. The geography itself seemed to favor the Muslims. The lands around Montgisard, near the castle of Ibelin, offered perfect terrain for cavalry, rolling hills and open plains where numbers would tell, where the greater force could envelop and destroy the smaller. The autumn rains hadn't yet begun, meaning firm, fast ground for charging horses. Every military manual, every precedent of warfare, every lesson from Caesar to Alexander said the same thing. In open battle, the larger, more mobile force wins, always. On November 23rd, Saladin made his second critical error. He bypassed the fortress of Ascalon, ignoring its garrison. Why waste time and men on sieges when Jerusalem itself, the ultimate prize, lay seemingly defenseless? His army, confident and eager, already tasting the riches of the holy city, spread out. Discipline relaxed. Foraging parties scattered across the countryside, thinking only of plunder. After all, what threat could 500 knights pose to 26,000? It was an arithmetic of arrogance. But hidden in the morning mist of November 25th, Baldwin's force had achieved the impossible. They had left Jerusalem in a desperate, forced march. 45 miles in 36 hours. This was an insane pace for healthy, fully laden men. For a king whose body was literally falling apart, it was a form of torture unparalleled. Templars took turns carrying Baldwin's litter when he lost consciousness from the jolting, searing pain. They marched not to defend Jerusalem's walls, but to find the one thing that might save the kingdom. Saladin's army, in the worst possible position, overconfident and dispersed. As the two forces converged, one bloated with pride and scattered for plunder, the other honed to a desperate, razor-sharp point by suffering. Neither side knew they were racing toward the most shocking military reversal in medieval history. The stage was set for a miracle or a massacre. November 25th dawned clear and hot, an unusual and oppressive heat for late autumn in the Levant. By 6 a.m., Baldwin's exhausted force had covered impossible ground, their horses foaming at the mouth, men swaying in their saddles with fatigue, their faces gaunt for lack of sleep. But then their scouts came back at a gallop, their faces alight with electrifying, terrifying news.
Saladin's army was not a cohesive block. It was spread across 3 miles of countryside, scattered in dozens of foraging parties, their guard completely down, their attention on loot and food. They were vulnerable. The Templar Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand, a man of legendary grimness, rode to Baldwin's litter. "Sire," he said, his voice tight with a suppressed excitement, "God has delivered them into our hands. They are scattered like sheep." But even this hardened warrior couldn't hide his shock at what their scouts reported next. The enemy numbers were even worse than they had feared. Not 20,000, but a full 26,000 warriors. Their banners, black, green, and gold, blackened the horizon like a storm front, a tapestry of impending doom. The reaction among Baldwin's knights was one of visible, gut-wrenching despair. Some openly wept, falling to their knees in prayer. Others simply stared, their faces pale, their hands trembling on their reins. The mathematics were impossible, a death sentence written in the dust. 52 enemies for every Christian knight. It was not a battle, it was a scheduled execution. But then Baldwin did something that etched his name into legend. Despite agony that would have killed most men, he demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed on his horse. The servants hesitated, but the fire in his eyes, visible even through the slits of his silver mask, brooked no argument. They strapped him into the saddle, his body a frail, pain-racked husk. He drew his sword. The act itself was a miracle. His bandaged, disfigured hands should not have been able to grip the hilt. Yet he held it aloft, a sliver of steel against an army. "Gentlemen," his voice rang out, clear and firm despite the suffering that racked his frame. "David faced Goliath with faith and a stone. We face 26,000 with God and our steel. Do not count their numbers. Make them count ours." At 11 a.m. in Saladin's camp, the first warning came. A dust-covered scout stumbled into the Sultan's tent. Dust clouds to the north, moving fast. Saladin's initial reaction was disbelief, then dismissal. The reports made no sense. Baldwin couldn't be so foolish as to leave Jerusalem's safety. It had to be a scouting party, a diversion, nothing more. This overconfidence, this fatal assumption of his enemy's weakness would cost him everything. By noon, the truth became undeniable. A cold dread seeping into the Muslim camp. Crusader banners appeared on the ridgeline, the blood-red cross of the Templars, the golden crosses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They were not hiding, they were arrayed for battle. Panic began to spread, a subtle virus infecting the mighty host. Saladin's scattered forces began frantically trying to reform their lines, trumpets blaring, officers screaming orders. But 3 miles is a vast distance when your enemy is already formed up and charging at full gallop. The ocean of steel was suddenly a confused, chaotic mess. Here's where it gets almost unbelievable, where Baldwin's tactical genius shone through his pain. Every ounce of military logic, every textbook written by Romans and Byzantines demanded that Baldwin wait. Let Saladin organize his lines, then perhaps retreat to a more defensible slope. Instead, the Leper King, seeing the confusion in the Muslim ranks, made a decision of breathtaking audacity. He would attack. Now. He raised his bandaged hand at exactly 2 p.m. It was the signal his knights had been praying for, the signal for glory or for a martyr's death. 500 lances, a forest of death, dropped to the charging position. The impossible, the suicidal attack had begun. But Saladin, in his haste and confidence, had missed one crucial detail of the terrain that would doom his army. His forces were split by a series of deep, dry ravines, cutting through the plain, invisible from a distance. What looked like open, perfect ground for cavalry was actually a terrain that would funnel fleeing men into natural death traps. Baldwin, despite his youth and suffering, had recognized what Saladin's decades of experience had blinded him to. The land itself was about to become a weapon. The Muslim army's reaction in those final moments tells us everything about their shock and disbelief. The elite Mamluks, warriors who'd faced Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian cavalry without flinching, simply froze. For precious, irreplaceable seconds, they couldn't process what they were seeing. 500 men charging 26,000 wasn't warfare, it was mass suicide, a madness that defied all understanding. Saladin himself, watching from his command position on a small hill, reportedly dropped his golden mace of command, an action his own chroniclers faithfully and painfully recorded, unable to hide their master's shock. "Madness," he whispered, his voice lost in the growing roar. Then louder, to his panicking officers, "Form the lines, form the lines." But forming lines takes time, discipline, and space. Baldwin had given them none. The Crusader charge covered 300 yards in under a minute. 500 ironclad horsemen, moving like a single focused avalanche, their battle cry of Dies Vult, God wills it, drowning out the desperate, disjointed orders of the Muslim commanders. The Templars' wedge, forming the deadly spear point of the charge, aimed directly for Saladin's still-forming center, for the very heart of the Muslim command. At 500 yards, the first Muslim arrows began to fall, a dark sleet of death. Knights slumped in their saddles. Horses screamed and tumbled, kicking up great gouts of earth, but the charge never wavered, never slowed. They were men possessed. At 200 yards, the full visceral terror of what was coming became clear to the Muslim front ranks. These weren't just knights. They were fanatics, men who believed death in battle guaranteed immediate entry into paradise. The Templars, especially, with their black and white Beauseant banners streaming overhead, came on like demons from a Christian hell, their silence as they closed, more terrifying than any war cry. At 100 yards, something extraordinary, something history should not record, happened. Baldwin himself, strapped to his saddle, bleeding from stress-reopened wounds beneath his armor, raised his sword high. The gesture was medically impossible. His diseased, numb hands should not have been able to grip the weapon, much less lift it. Yet every chronicle, Christian and Muslim alike, records it. The Leper King was leading from the absolute front, a beacon of doomed courage. At 50 yards, the Muslim horses began to back up, to rear and whinny in terror, despite their riders' frantic efforts. The animals sensed the doom, the wall of flesh and steel and faith that was seconds from impact. And doom was upon them. The ground literally shook under thousands of hooves. Dust clouds rose like the smoke of a great fire. The noise was indescribable, a thunder of hooves mixed with war cries in Latin, French, and Arabic. The clash of shields and weapons being readied. Prayers screamed to two different gods, begging for victory or for a merciful death. 2 p.m. struck like the hammer of God himself. The Templar wedge, 80 knights packed into a dense, unstoppable triangle, smashed into the half-formed Muslim center at full gallop. The sound was not of men fighting, but of mountains colliding, a deep, sickening crash of wood, metal, and bone that men 5 miles away later claimed they heard, a sound that haunted their dreams for years. In those first horrific seconds, 300 Mamluks simply ceased to exist. They were not killed, they were erased, crushed under the hooves of the massive destriers, their bodies pulped or transfixed by 12-foot ashwood lances that punched through armor, shield, and body with ease. The momentum of the charge was so great that lances often skewered 2, sometimes 3 men, pinning them together in a bloody, dying tapestry. But the real shock, The tactical surprise that shattered the Muslim will wasn't the initial impact, it was what followed. Instead of wheeling away after the charge, the standard, almost ritualistic cavalry tactic, the Templars did the unthinkable. They kept going. They dropped their shattered lances, drew their long swords and fearsome maces, and drove deeper into the Muslim ranks, like a surgeon's blade seeking a heart, not stopping to plunder, not stopping to take prisoners, just killing, pushing, driving forward with a single-minded, terrifying purpose. Behind them, Baldwin's 420 secular knights struck in a second massive wave, exploiting the gaping, bloody hole torn by the warrior monks. They hit the disorganized flanks of the center, their charge no less devastating for coming second. The Muslim line, which had been bending, was now cracking. 2:15 p.m. brought the first impossible moment of the battle. Saladin's center, comprising 8,000 of Islam's finest cavalry, began to buckle. Not a tactical retreat, but a buckle, like a dam cracking under a pressure it was never designed to hold. The Muslim commanders, emirs and veterans of a dozen campaigns, couldn't believe their eyes. How could 500 exhausted, outnumbered knights be not just holding, but pushing back a force 16 times their number? It defied reality. Then something happened that defied all military and biological logic. The Crusader horses, exhausted from their 45-mile forced march, their coats lathered in sweat, their lungs heaving, should have been failing. Their strength should have given out. Instead, they fought like creatures possessed, as if the same divine fire that burned in their riders had filled their veins. War horses, trained for combat, bit and kicked with ferocity, their iron-shod hooves caving in skulls and breaking limbs, adding to the carnage. One chronicler tells of a single Templar horse, its rider dead, that continued charging through the Muslim ranks alone, trampling warriors, spreading panic by its very uncontrolled demonic presence. 2:30 p.m. saw panic begin its deadly, invisible work. A Muslim regiment on Saladin's left wing, seeing the center collapse into a chaotic melee, began edging backward. Not fleeing, just edging. A step here, a step there. But in battle, hesitation is more contagious than the plague. Within minutes, the backward drift became a stream, then a river. The sense of impending doom was a physical force, a stink in the air. But then came Baldwin's masterstroke, the move that transformed a successful charge into a world-shattering victory. His 3,000 infantry, whom he had hidden in dead ground, a dip in the terrain invisible to the Muslim army, suddenly appeared on the Muslim right flank, screaming and beating their shields. The psychological impact was devastating, far greater than their military value. To Saladin's already rattled forces, it seemed as if entire new Crusader armies were materializing from the very earth itself. Shouts of "We're surrounded! Qatarna!" spread through the Muslim ranks like wildfire. It was militarily nonsense. 3,000 infantry could not surround 26,000, but panic doesn't calculate odds. It only feels terror. The impossible was happening. 26,000 warriors were being routed by a force they outnumbered 52 to 1. 2:45 p.m. marked the moment when battle became massacre, when the field of Montgisard became a slaughterhouse. As Muslim forces, their cohesion utterly gone, tried to flee, they discovered the full extent of Baldwin's tactical genius. Those unseen ravines, the ones Saladin had dismissed, now became death traps. Knights, their bloodlust up, pursued the fleeing Muslims straight into these natural bottlenecks. The chronicles describe horrors that defy the imagination. Men trampling each other in a frantic screaming rush to escape, horses with broken legs screaming in agony that was drowned out by the human terror. Warriors throwing away their expensive helmets, their shields, even their swords, anything to run faster. But then the truly unthinkable happened, the event that sealed Saladin's humiliation. At 3 p.m., Saladin's personal guard, his Hulka, 2,000 of his finest Mamluks who had sworn oaths to die before abandoning their sultan, broke. These were men who had faced Mongol cavalry without flinching, who wore their scars like holy relics, whose entire lives were dedicated to the protection of one man. Yet faced with Templars who fought like men already seeing the gates of paradise, who showed no fear, no pain, no mercy, they ran. They turned their horses and fled the field. Saladin himself, watching his invincible army disintegrate into a mindless fleeing mob, made a decision that would haunt his reputation forever. Seeing his standard-bearer cut down, his golden banner falling into the mud, he knew the battle was lost. Abandoning his magnificent warhorse, too slow, too visible for escape, he was hustled onto the back of a racing camel from his baggage train. The sight of their sultan, the great Saladin, the uniter of Islam, fleeing the field on a pack animal, was the final, shattering blow to the Muslim army's spirit. If Saladin ran, what hope did a common soldier have? The last shreds of resistance melted away. 3:30 p.m. saw the pursuit become a full-blown annihilation. Crusader knights, their initial exhaustion burned away by adrenaline and religious fervor, chased the fleeing Muslims for miles. The killing was mechanical, efficient, and horrible. Lances were long broken. They used swords, the fine Damascus steel blades rising and falling in bloody arcs until their edges were blunted. Swords blunted, they used maces and war hammers. Weapons designed not to cut, but to crush bone and pulp flesh. Some Templars, their weapons lost, were seen beating enemies to death with the pommels of their daggers or with their own helmets. The very ground became a quagmire, slippery with blood and entrails. The dust turned to a crimson mud. Modern historians and equine experts still can't explain this part of the battle. How did 500 exhausted knights, on horses pushed to the brink of collapse, maintain a ferocious pursuit for 2 hours? How did these animals, their hearts near bursting, find the strength to run down fresh Muslim cavalry, to maintain the momentum of the kill? The Christian chroniclers had a simple, unwavering answer. God's own strength flowed through them, man and beast alike. The Muslim chroniclers, horrified by the scale of the defeat, agreed in their own way. Ibn Falathir called it a divine punishment, a scourge from Allah upon their pride and overconfidence. 4 p.m. brought scenes that would haunt the historical records for centuries. The ravines, those natural features Baldwin had recognized and Saladin had ignored, became charnel houses. Muslims fell in layers, the dead cushioning the falling dying, the dying suffocating under the weight of more dead who jumped or were pushed on top of them. Some ravines literally filled with bodies from rim to rim, creating macabre bridges of flesh and bone that the living tried to cross in their desperation to escape. The pursuit only ended when the Crusader horses, their mighty hearts finally giving out after achieving the impossible, began to collapse in heaps, dying of sheer exhaustion. Baldwin himself fought on, despite an agony that defies human description. Strapped to his saddle, unable to even feel his sword hand, he nonetheless directed charge after charge, his voice, though strained, never wavering. Knights who fought beside him that day later swore they saw tears of blood seeping from beneath his silver mask, his diseased body literally weeping from the monumental effort of will. Yet he never called for rest, never showed a moment of weakness. He was the soul of the army, and his soul was made of iron. The Templar Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand provided the battle's most chilling, iconic moment. Finding a group of 500 Mamluks who had managed to rally on a small hillock, trying to form a defensive square, he gathered just 12 of his knights around him. Without a moment's hesitation, he led a charge up the slope into the heart of the 500. The shock of this audacious attack broke the Mamluks' fragile courage, and they were slaughtered. When asked later how 12 men could break 500 of the finest soldiers in the world, Odo replied simply, "They feared God's wrath. We embodied it." The statistical shock of Montgisard comes from every angle, every source. By 4:30 p.m., Muslim dead carpeted the field for 3 miles. Bodies clogged the ravines 20 feet deep. Abandoned weapons, swords, lances, bows, quivers of arrows, littered the ground like some bizarre iron harvest. The streaming banners of Islam's greatest army, including Saladin's personal standard, lay trampled in the mud, a mud made from dust and blood. But the numbers that truly stagger the mind come from the Muslim sources themselves. Of the 26,000 warriors who woke that morning confident of victory and paradise, fewer than 2,000 saw the sun set. The Crusaders lost 1,100 men, a devastating 31% of their entire force, a testament to how heavily engaged they were, but nothing compared to the Islamic catastrophe. It wasn't a defeat, it was near total annihilation, on a scale medieval warfare rarely witnessed. Over 90% of Saladin's army was killed, captured, or scattered to the winds. As the sun began to set on that blood-soaked field, the impossible had become a brutal, tangible reality. The setting sun of November 25th illuminated a vision from the Book of Revelation itself. Where Saladin's mighty host had stood that morning, only the dead and the dying remained. 20,000 Muslim dead. The number still staggers the imagination. Bodies lay so thick that Crusader horses, now walking skeletons, had to pick their way carefully, as if walking on a grotesque, fleshy carpet. The ravines had become mass graves, filled to overflowing. Baldwin, finally allowing his body to surrender, was carefully lifted from his horse. He collapsed immediately into the arms of his knights. They rushed to support their dying king, to offer him water and comfort, but he waved them away, insisting on one final act of leadership and piety. There, on that field of death, surrounded by the spoils of a miraculous victory, the Leper King led his exhausted, blood-soaked army in a hymn of thanksgiving. Non nobis, Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo da glorio, they chanted, their voices hoarse but fervent. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give the glory. The sight of 500 blood-soaked killers kneeling in prayer, while surrounded by 20,000 corpses, struck even the most hardened warriors as something surreal, something holy and terrible all at once. But wait, the aftermath gets even more insane. The immediate material gains defied all calculation. Saladin's army had carried the wealth of Egypt and Syria to sustain a long campaign. Gold dinars, silver dirhams, masterwork weapons, thousands of horses, enough supplies for 26,000 men for months. In 3 hours, it all became Crusader property. The chronicles list the haul in awe. Enough weapons and armor to equip 10 armies, enough gold from Saladin's war chest to fund the nearly bankrupt Kingdom of Jerusalem for 2 years. Thousands of horses, including purebred Arabian stallions worth a king's ransom. The Templars alone captured enough military equipment to outfit every Christian fortress in the Levant. In one afternoon, the bankrupt kingdom became solvent, its armies re-equipped, its morale transformed from despair to invincible faith. Saladin's humiliation was complete and total. The man who'd never known defeat arrived in Cairo days later, with fewer than 2,000 survivors from his 26,000-strong host. His racing camel had saved his life, but the image destroyed his reputation. A sultan who flees on a pack animal does not inspire loyalty or fear. His emirs, the same men who had been greedily dividing up the conquered lands of Jerusalem that very morning, now openly questioned his sultan's judgment, his luck, and his courage. The Muslim chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, usually a sycophant, couldn't hide the scope of the disaster, calling it a day of mourning for Islam. The psychological impact on the Muslim world was devastating. If 26,000 of the faithful could not defeat 500 Christians, what did that say about divine favor? It created a crisis of faith that took years to overcome. Back in Jerusalem, the city erupted in disbelieving celebration when the news arrived. Church bells rang for 3 days straight, their peals a song of deliverance. But in the royal chamber, Baldwin IV lay dying, the life ebbing from him. The physical toll of the battle on his ravaged body was catastrophic. His physicians warned he might not survive the night. Yet somehow, impossibly, Baldwin endured. His will, which had held an army together, now held his own body to the world of the living. When asked how he'd found the strength to fight, to lead, to win, Baldwin whispered a reply that would become legend. Pain means nothing when God requires service. The strategic implications of Montgisard were staggering. Saladin's power base in Egypt nearly collapsed from the shock of the defeat. His Syrian allies questioned their allegiance. The careful political and military alliance he had built over decades cracked under the strain of a single afternoon's catastrophe. Military historians calculate it took Saladin a full 10 years to politically recover and rebuild a force comparable to the one Baldwin destroyed in 3 hours. The Crusader states, granted this miraculous, unbelievable reprieve, gained a precious decade they had never dared hope for. In the end, the field of Montgisard stands as history's most glorious, most tragic last stand. A single blinding moment when the impossible became reality, when 500 stood against 26,000 and won. When a Leper King's bandaged hands, guided by a will of iron and a faith of fire, gripped the reins of history, and for one perfect, bloody afternoon, turned the entire world. If this story of impossible courage against unimaginable odds ignited something in you, if the image of a dying boy king defying an empire reminds you that the human spirit can conquer any calculus of despair, then do not let this lesson fade. Subscribe now, because history is not just a record of what was, it is a warning and a promise of what could be. It proves that a single will, forged in the fires of faith and desperation, can shatter the destiny that an entire world has written for it. The story of Baldwin IV is not just a tale from the past, it is a blueprint for confronting the impossible in your own life. We are just getting started. We will hunt for more stories lost to time, more legends written in blood and steel, more moments where a single decision changed the course of civilization. We will dive into the secret strategies, the forgotten heroes, and the haunting truths that your history books left out. Don't just witness history, understand the force of will that creates it. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next chapter we reveal will change how you see the world all over again. Prove that one person's courage can change everything. Your subscription isn't just a click, it's a vote to remember the giants upon whose shoulders we stand. The next chapter is yours to uncover.